Okay. Now we're recording, we're not live.
Right.
Okay. And I kept wanting to bring my headphones. That's how out of style I am. I thought, well, what do you need them for, Dave? Nobody's going to call you and answer your question.
No.
Okay.
Talking about answering questions. You did the morning, what do you call that, on Saturday mornings?
It was called Old Town Cleveland, and it's on Whoop FM. And my late husband,
Ron.
Moore,
I knew Ron.
He, I'm trying to figure out how to say it. He kept saying to me, we go out to eat, people would pull up a chair and sit down. Do you know where so-and-so cemetery is? Let me tell you a story about my great-grandpa. What do you know about, the removal of the Indians? Just anything. And I'd always have an answer, even if it's just kind of what I really don't know, but kind of answer. Mm-hmm. And so he said, let's do a radio show. And I said, are you crazy? He said, who wants to call in and listen to me talk about where things used to be?
Are you originally from Cleveland?
Oh, yeah. Where else would this accent be from?
What was your maiden name?
My last name was Stevenson.
Stevenson. Who are you related to here? Or where'd you grow up?
I grew up down in the southeast corner of Bradley County, mostly like down on Keith Valley Road.
Buck's Pocket?
Buck's Pocket's
it's
the suburb where I live.
Yeah.
But we lived down on Keith Valley Road.
Was that Ron Hill? Chicken farm?
I don't. That was after my time.
When you go all the way through Keith Valley Road, where does it dead end into Georgia?
I don't know where it goes. It goes all the way down. Way down into Whitfield County.
Golly.
Well, yes, it does. You need to drive that sometime to see.
I used to drive it quite often, but I almost forgot.
Actually, I think it goes down and it dead ends, and you have to turn left or right on a road down there. If you go right, you go over Cahulla Creek. You go left, it takes you over to another road. My sister is the last house on Keith Valley Road before you pass over into Georgia.
Now, there used to be an old convenience store there, right?
There was
ago.
An old country store that was run by Cora Shields. And
on the left, going out?
Well, on the left going down Keith Valley, that was the Donahue store, and it was called the country store. As a child, I remember going there on Sundays when it was closed. And we'd get a bag of ice, and there was a bucket up on the top that you put a quarter in or 50 cents in to get your bag of ice. And it was just sitting up there. Nobody bothered it.
Did they have gas?
I don't remember them ever having gas. I remember them having candy cigarettes. That's what I always wanted when I went.
But now the one that you were referring to
is on the right, just after you pass over into Georgia. And my dad was born in 1918, and he grew up on the family farm that I lived on, like when I was in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. And the lady had that same store then when he was a little boy, like 5 or 6 years old. And she operated that store well into the 80s. And it was just, I don't remember it having gas. It may have had at some point in time.
And those were really convenience then,
yes.
Right? Because if you were there, where would you go get milk or bread?
Okay, see, we would have to go to Donahue's, but see, that was still probably a 15-minute drive from my house. And see, Dollar General's taken over for those little country stores.
I guess that's what they've done.
Because they're not close to anything else much.
No.
And
they say that Dollar Generals want to get you coming and going from the suburbs.
Right. That's right. That's right. That's where you go when you don't want to go into a big crowd or anything like
now,
that. Now,
if you're in Cleveland, close to Deer Park, there's an old 2-story building there. I'm not sure what road it's on. It may be 11th Street. That used to be an old residential grocery store.
I don't know which building you're talking about. But that happened a lot because people would, like Cora Shields, her store finally was separate from her house. And the Donahue's was separate. But before that, the first store that MC Hedrick had, and I believe it was down in Flint Springs.
Is that right?
Yes, way back. The Hedrick store. They would live in part of the house, and then just the front portion of the house was a store. and there was a little window or something, a door or something that came down that had a hole in it, and you could go up and ask for stuff, and they would sell you the stuff through the door. You know, when it was dark or night or whatever. If you had.
And where did they get their stuff from? Just traveling?
I guess. And I think they ordered a lot of stuff from catalogs. See, we're back to that kind of ordering too.
Isn't that funny how it goes back and forth?
What goes around comes around.
You know, if you could sit down and think about what has happened, you could almost predict the future. Not exact. Like you say, well, oh, Amazon, that's
ordering from the catalog.
That's ordering from the catalog. That's all it is. We think he's come up with something new, but it's not.
No, I never thought it would be as big as it has gotten. You know, I thought that it would be, okay, popular, but I think the pandemic has increased that mode of buying things tremendously, to the point that some people have gone broke because they sat at home and ordered stuff.
That's right. You know, I go to Starbucks every morning. When the pandemic hit, they said you had to order from this app. And it took me about 3 times aggravating trying to figure out how to do it. And now, that's the only way I do it.
Well, we recently at church went to Zoom meetings. And the folks, especially the folks older than me, were just in an absolute panic. But then they decided they loved seeing everybody and talking to them during the Bible study class. So I think that we're all getting used to it. And Lord have mercy if it goes down. It's a panic.
What else is there that has changed, that has come back around? I guess in a sense, these, you go to the doctor. Used to, the doctor would come to your house.
Well, now they televise
now
it.
you can do it on.
And man, isn't that convenient? You know, if you've got a child that's a little bit sick, and I don't know if I guess you're aware of this, the nurses at the schools, if they have the proper signage of papers and stuff, can call up the parent or tell the parent that they're going to call the doctor's office. They have the telemedicine visit with the doctor with the child. The nurse has everything there to test for strep and take their temperature and check their ears and all that kind of stuff. Well, when the parents get there, the prescription's already been sent to the pharmacy. And sometimes they can pick up the prescription before they pick up the child.
Was that due to the pandemic?
No, that had started before.
Oh.
Of course, I taught a number of years where we didn't have a nurse in the school.
Now, what about this? I've often thought this. If they come out with these electric cars and you're able to pull in your garage and plug your car in, now you're going to, now theoretically, the convenience stores don't need to sell gas. So they would go back to the Donahue style of having a convenience store without gas, which is the Dollar General.
Speaking of that, let's talk about something that's interesting. This little trolley that was up at the Caney
I saw
Village on
that,
McCoy.
yeah, because Doc Garner was here a couple weeks.
German,
yeah.
The expert on all of this, and he's passed now, and I sure hate that. See the trolley over on the left-hand side? It's just a small trolley on a narrow gauge rail. Now, at night, they take it down to Powerhouse number 2 and plug that sucker up and charge it up for the next day.
We're back where we were.
And that was 1918.
You know, he told me in this when he was here, and I really liked him. He said that there were sidewalks there, but on any of the pictures, I've not seen sidewalks.
Well, you can kind of see. I'm sorry, folks, you can't see this stuff. You can kind of see it there, but there were. Here you go. Here's Doc and his brother on their little car that they made.
That was him.
Look at that sidewalk. Okay.
Oh yeah, that is a sidewalk. He was right.
1918, they had.
Which one's Doc?
I think the bigger one, but I'm not sure about that without looking. Okay, all the homes had running water. Now, this is in 1918. Bathrooms, a telephone, but Doc would say, we didn't have anybody to call us. We didn't know anybody else on the phone. Of course, they could call the powerhouse, see. They had street lights, fire hydrants, concrete sidewalks. See, they had the concrete because of the dam. The dam had its own concrete plant, okay? A water filtration system, that would filter their water. They had a full-size tennis court. They had a big fence around it so the ball would not go into the lake. And it had lights so you could play at night. And I mean,
That's why people would come there on the weekends, because they had a place to.
There were a lot of young men came there to, quote, play tennis, but they were coming to check out the girls and wanting the court. But you know how that is.
Yeah. That hadn't changed.
That hadn't changed either, has it?
Why is it that history, what makes you so interested in history?
Well, I started out, my mom was, we'd be driving along and she'd see somebody sitting on the porch and she'd say, oh, that's Mrs. Bean. Her mama was a so-and-so. And she could tell you their whole life history. Go to the cemetery with her. Especially in a community that she had lived in, she could tell you about everybody. I thought everybody's mom did that. Well, no, they don't. But I kind of was the person in the family that got that. And so especially after I started having children, I started asking her questions and writing down what she told me and about the family. And she took me back 100 years on my dad's side of the family and her side of the family, all the relatives and stuff. She could name the kids and what years they were born. And I thought, oh gosh, that's amazing, you know. But then I wrote a lot of it down and you know, started sharing it with the families and stuff. I got into it too because other people would be researching stuff in this area and they would need to know where Beeler's Spring was. Well, my dad was an avid hunter, just rabbit hunting and stuff, but I'd tag along with him, and so I knew where a lot of springs were and gaps were and things like that. And Ron had worked, my late husband Ron had worked as a policeman for the sheriff's department, so he was out and about and he would show me the old cemeteries and stuff. And then he went to work for the cable company, and he was all over every inch of this county. And I could ask him, and he could just take me there. Or he'd say, well, I think it's over, and then I'd research, and he was right. So I kind of got into that, and that got me into studying the Trail of Tears a lot, because people from Oklahoma would need to know, what road do you think that they took? Well, you know, I could look it up. And so that's just kind of how I got into it. And then I just talked with people about it a lot. And like I say, we'd go out to eat, and people were at my table or I was over there.
So it just interests you for whatever reason.
Just a curious nature about me. I remember asking Bill Sparkman. There was a big monument right up the road here for Jack Walker. It was put in like 1925 or something. Jack Walker was a leader of the Cherokees before the removal. And his farm, we're sitting on his farm right now. And there was a big monument that was put in. It was just this huge boulder-looking thing with a brass plate on it that explained who he was. Well, during some construction work, it mysteriously disappeared in the 70s. And I had a picture of it, and I was asking Bill Sparkman, who was a local farmer, and he was the manager of the farmers co-op here for years. Oh, I think that's probably about a 5-ton boulder. Well, then that would lead us to another conversation. So I was just always gathering information from people. That was a long answer, but that's my answer. It's just a curiosity and interest of mine.
You know, in the big scheme of things, these things we're talking about were not that far away. Time-wise.
Well, that's when you start studying history and you start studying family history, you realize what a little bitty speck in time we are. We're just here for just a very short time compared to history.
You know, have you ever studied Rott?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Interesting character,
He
right?
was an interesting character, yes he was.
And that was in 1850s, 58.
Yes, yeah.
And that was in the same period that Gunsmoke was supposed to be portrayed in.
Yeah.
You know, it was the same period. So if you want to know what it was like then, it was about, of course, that was Kansas and we were here. But then you go back to 40 more years and it was all Cherokee Nation.
Yes.
And all they had was trails.
Now they had the federal road, the old federal road what we call the Old Federal Road.
That went with the ferry and all? The
Okay.
ferry at Old Federal Road?
Yeah, are you familiar with the ferry?
Yeah.
Okay. You know that the boats were pulled out and
Yeah.
taken down to.
Yeah.
Now, I did learn
Yeah.
something new this week. Let's mark this in history.
Okay.
I've always been interested in the McNairs. You know, they bring the boats from up on the Coy River by wagon, bring it down, and then they would put it back in the water at McNairs on the Conasauga River. Well, the headwaters for the Conasauga River is where New Echota is in Calhoun, which was declared the Cherokee Nation at some point in time. So that means next time I go to New Echota, I want to see those headwaters. Isn't that interesting? I mean,
It's
there's
interesting.
the connection. I thought, oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times the McNairs were important people because they were, you know, business-like. And the road there's a road that's often referred to as the road that went from McNairs to Knoxville. But I think the thing that interests, when the first time somebody told me this, I thought, man, that's interesting. When you stood before 1838 on the Hiwassee River and you looked north at Calhoun, you were standing in the Cherokee Nation and you were looking at the United States of America.
That was the border.
That was the border. And you had to have a passport. You had to have your papers to come. You had to prove that you were coming into the Cherokee. A white man would have to prove he was coming into the Cherokee Nation to provide some work that would be beneficial to the Cherokees before he could come
Who
in.
policed that? The Cherokee?
The Cherokee did. And then, of course, later on, the U.S. government came in and policed that kind of thing.
The Cherokee were not savages like
They
on
were not
TV.
savages living in teepees wearing big old headdresses and running around bareback on horses. No, they weren't. They were some very astute business people.
I think the problem that if I was to guess, the problem maybe have been they weren't as cohesive. Their government might not have been as cohesive as ours was at the time.
I think that they just didn't possibly think that people would be that low as to come in and just steal their land. But you had all these white people coming in, and they could get this little parcel of land over here, but they were going to have to chop down all the trees and pull up all the roots.
Yeah.
And the stumps and stuff to be farmers. And they'd look across the way, and there was that Cherokee living over there in a big 2-story log house with all the outbuildings, and he had cattle. You could occupy as much land as you could make productive. The Cherokees before, you know, they got certain lots.
Who determined what was productive?
The leaders, the Cherokee leaders.
How did you become a Cherokee leader?
Just the same way we become leaders in our community. There was somebody, you know, people will often say, oh, you know, Chief Black Fox. Black Fox wasn't a chief, but he was probably the guy that kept law and order, settled disputes, helped the poor.
Kind of a straw boss.
He was the strong person in that community that everybody relied on for that kind of thing.
Now, my understanding there was a Chief Candies, and that's how we got Candies Creek.
Well, he wasn't a chief. His name was Peter Candy, and his property, Candies Creek. Well, if you got on that body of water in Hamilton County and walked this way, you got to the Candy Farm. That's why it was called Candies Creek. CANDY''S.
We changed it to IES, right?
Because the U.S. government said you couldn't have an apostrophe S in the name of any place like that. They made an exception for Martha's Vineyard and maybe one or two other exceptions. Because Harris Creek was Hare's Creek, HARE''S, after Hare Conrad that lived in the cabin over on Blythewood Farm. If you were walking from White Oak Mountain and you were following that creek, you knew you were going to get to Hare's place.
Now, Hare
Conrad.
Conrad was
He was a leader.
how was that related to Margot Everhart or Miss Neal? Wasn't there a relation?
The only relationship
Isn't
is
that Blythewood Farms now?
Yes, that's the only relationship. Her daddy bought that farm in 1926 or whatever.
But wasn't there an attorney in that era that was named Conrad?
No. Conrad Fennell was around here, but
there was. I thought there was one. So you think the Neals bought that from?
the Neals bought it from. It's like their names were almost like Lancaster. I'll think of it here in a minute. But that house was built in 1870. The big house on the farm.
The one that Margot lives in?
Yes. And the little house was built, I guess, I don't know when that was built, but Mrs. Neal had lived there for quite a long time. And then you see the little cabin is the next thing.
Was that Harry Conrad's place?
It was his property, yes.
But he was way prior to that, I guess, right? So when would Harry...
That building is the oldest, that cabin is the oldest.
The one that Miss
structure.
Neal lived in?
No, she never lived in it. It's just that little cabin that sits there.
Past it on the left?
Yes.
I think they're remodeling it right now.
Well, what they're doing is remodeling Margot's house and Miss Neal's house, and that's their staging area.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that they didn't have to drive so far off and stuff.
I see.
And but they're not. She wasn't not related to them.
So Harry Conrad, when did he own? He was like a.
He built that. We think about 1800. It's the oldest standing structure in Bradley County that we can put a date on, and it's still standing. It qualified for the Registry of Historic Places because it's still in its original spot. Up until probably the 1950s or so, it was used. People lived in it that worked on the farm. They'd put electricity in it. It was the biggest change they had made to it. And so about 1970-something, she had it worked on, restored, everything you needed to do to keep it standing. I was in it 2 weeks ago, and it's really still in it.
But he wasn't a chief.
He was not a chief, but he led the very first detachment of Cherokee that left here going on the Trail of Tears, so that tells me something.
Was he...
He was a leader. He was the son-in-law of Mr. Candy, Peter Candy.
He married Peter
into
Candy's
the
daughter?
Yes. He married into that family.
Now, were they on the Trail of Tears too? Did Mr. Candy and Mr.
I believe Peter had died by then, but now Herr Conrad obviously went, and he got sick along the way, and his...
was he forced out, or he was bought out, right? Theoretically.
Well, I wrote that book. In 1835, the U.S. government came around to all the Cherokee families and said, we need to get a count of how many people. And they would just write down the name of the head male, and then 3 women, 2 this, nothing else had names, including their slaves. They had slaves too. Some of
the Cherokee had slaves.
Yes, the richer Cherokees had slaves.
Now, to that point, the Cherokee ran the Utes out, right? Weren't they here? The Ute Indians were here before the Cherokee.
Yes, and see, the Cherokee had only been here 200 years.
Where did they come from, the Cherokee?
Well, when you see the map that shows, their property went all the way up into Kentucky and Virginia and Alabama and Georgia. It was just several states that was their property. In each treaty, they lost a little bit of land. And another treaty, they lost...
But where did they come from, the Cherokee? And the Ute Indians that they ran out...
They were just living here. I mean, the natives were just here. Long before old Christopher Columbus was lost and thought he found us.
They were already here.
Oh, they'd been here for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm. And how did they get here?
I don't know.
You don't go back that far.
I don't know if that anybody knows. We always say they came over the straits of something, but it doesn't.
The water was down.
It does not take much imagination to go to Mexico and you see people there that could have just walked by land up in here. Hey, it's cooler up here. Let's go up here and live. People just moved to get food and water and shelter and to get away from other people, I think.
But isn't it funny that the Cherokee were here they're living, they're thriving, they got their rules. And this other government comes in and says, we're going to give you a form of our money.
Well, and that let me that's one of the sad parts too. Okay, you have this that we counted everybody. Well, then the next year, just to be sure that they give them something close to what the property would actually be worth, they came back around and evaluated everybody's property. And there were over 500 entries. They were all in that old writing, that beautiful old writing that you can't read. It was anything that you couldn't take with you if you happened to leave. So they could have 100 head of cattle. They didn't get anything for those. You couldn't take your dog, you couldn't take your cattle, you couldn't take, anything like that that had to be fed, basically, unless you were riding it or it was pulling a wagon. And, but they got paid for fruit trees because that was something that was valuable then. I mean, to have peach trees and apple trees and plum trees was really something exotic then. And
they moved them to where? To the Tahlequah?
Tahlequah, which is a diversion of the word Tellico.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tellico was a major place. But anyway, they came around and evaluated your property. Oh, well, you've got a big house and you've got a corn crib and you've got a barn and you've got a well. Some of them had dug wells. In 1838, they had dug wells, which amazes me.
Yeah.
Most of them had just spring houses, so they were living where the springs were. And I'm going to give you the $300 that your property's worth. They gave them the money. And they sent them up to, and they fought it. They went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against the U.S., and Andrew Jackson didn't act on it. And so then they were removed. But it was the worst drought in recorded history because there had been a volcano somewhere in South America and it had blocked I don't know. Anyway, got the weather all messed up and there was no rain. Well, their big theory is that they could gather up these folks, take them up to Charleston, put them in a thing that looked like a dormitory down on next to the river and send them out a boat, every now and then, and that would be easy and fast and not too bad. Well, they did that.
Did they want to go?
No, they didn't want to go. 4 boats went. The first 2 with very little trouble, very few deaths, and then all the water dried up. And the next ones got stranded out in Arkansas in the middle of June, and the people had to walk the rest of the way. If you've ever been to Arkansas in June, you know that's a problem. And so I think it was a lot of deaths. A lot of people ran away and came back here. They didn't, we always see the pictures on TV of the soldier with a knife in their back, and a lot of them just had someone from the military that was helping them find food and doing correspondence and stuff. They really didn't have groups of soldiers that went with them like what we imagine they did.
So they could have just walked back here.
Well, they could walk back here, but they couldn't go back to their house. There's somebody else already living in their house.
Because their government sold it to our government.
The U.S. government declared that they were insolvent, or they weren't a real government, I guess is what you'd say. And that was all proven by Jack Walker's murder. We're sitting on his land right here, Jack Walker's land. Jack Walker had a conflict with some folks, mostly about bringing moonshine into this.
Is he the guy that got shot coming home?
Yes. He got
I'm good at this stuff, aren't I?
Well, you know enough to be dangerous.
Yeah.
He'd left Red Cloud for one of the councils. And he'd kind of gone cross country thinking that there might be a problem. He was kind of heading over towards McNair's, but then he was going to come around and come home, from what I understand. He was ambushed, killed.
And they never really proved it was 2 Indians.
It was 2 Indians. They took them to court. The court records are still in Athens, Tennessee, in the courthause.
What year would this have been?
That was
1839,
35 or something.
Yeah.
See, it was before, probably a little bit before that. I can't, maybe 34. I don't remember. Anyway, they came up and said, "Oh, we're going to try." The Cherokees said, "We're going to try them. We know who they are. That's so and so Foreman and so Springston. We know who they are." And the U.S. government said no, and a judge ruled that they were in. It was I won't say an insolvent nation, is the word they used, and so it'll have to be tried in the U.S. There went all of their legal powers and stuff went right out the door with that, and then it just started falling like, dominoes falling or something, and so his and so they did all this trial and stuff, and nothing was ever done to them.
But now, when they moved them out, are they still there? I guess you could.
Okay, you could come back in 3 or 4 months if you had the means, but that's another thing where I was getting to about them being stuck in Charleston. So they kept taking all the groups up there. They didn't stop gathering people up or telling people. A lot of the church leaders said, "We can't fight this. Y'all just come on. On this date, we're all just going to go up there and check ourselves in and get in line to go." Because you couldn't fight it. And so many of the leaders were afraid of bloodshed because of what had happened with the Creek and the Seminole when they fought stuff. There was big wars and stuff, and they just didn't want them. But anyway, so they were all going up there. Then they get stuck. There's no shelters. You've got your $300 in your pocket for your farm that's going to help you get started out west. And there's 17 vendors show up. And they're selling sewing needles and pots to cook in and tents, canvas to make tents. And so they spent their money surviving.
Mm-hmm. In Toccoa or on the
right
way?
Right here in Charleston, Tennessee. They spent their money before they left because they were having to provide, they'd come around and give them food, but they didn't give them everything they needed. They didn't have, we just don't, we don't have canvas. But this is how serious and crazy the government was. Over in Calhoun, which was the United States of America during the removal, they had an arsenal. They had 60 field cannons. They had an incredible amount of swords, bayonets, guns, and the people to use them. And if there had been any uprising, they would have shot field cannons on those unarmed people.
Now, where they had, when you go down Upper River Road, there's that red structure that says this is where it's believed was Case Landing.
Fort Cass?
Fort Cass, yeah.
Yes.
They're not really certain if it was there or...
Fort Cass was 4 miles wide, 12 miles long. And it didn't have, we saw those cowboy movies. You got the big high fences and the gates open. Well, it wasn't that. It was just Reverend Bushyhead lived right over here at Cleveland High School. He brought his people from his church, and they just got close to a spring, so they'd have water. Hopefully some rocks or something for shelter, trees for shelter and stuff. And the government would come by with the wagon and might give them some supplies, to eat food wise and stuff. But it was just crazy. Just crazy.
It's a real bad time in American history.
I have talked to 3rd graders, 2nd graders, all the way up to senior adults about this, and I always start out with, I'm getting ready to talk about an ugly story, because there's nothing pretty about this.
What would have been the alternative for them to just say, y'all are American citizens?
Yes. Well, let me...
of course, we invaded them, right?
We invaded them. And I have been to meetings and heard members of the Cherokee Nation say it was a good thing. First time they said that, I said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, if we had stayed there, we would have assimilated with the white people. We would have lost our culture, our language, our dances, our drums. We would have lost all of our arts had we stayed there. So in that way, it was a good thing that we were moved. Now, down at Flint Springs, where where the two springs are, right there in front of the old schoolhouse. There was a Cherokee mission there. There were 40 families living in that area, including John Ross. 40 families were in that area, and all the young women, teenage women, not all of them, a selection of young women, went to that mission school. It was started in 35, so it wasn't there very long. And they were being trained to be teachers when they got out west. The Cherokee knew they were going to have to learn the language, our language, and our ways, and educate their young people if they were going to survive.
Because the white man was going to take over this way or that way.
Yes. And so those young women were studying astronomy, geology, all these advanced classes.
250 years ago.
250 years ago, documented. It's documented that they were down there studying advanced things. And when they went out west, that's one of the first things they started was the academies to start teaching the children.
Now they had, you say they had slaves. Where did they get their slaves?
They bought them like everybody else.
How?
Judge John Martin, his house has a big brown sign in front of it down on Dalton Pike. It was over where Mr. Hoskins' house is now. Originally, it was moved, but it was there. It was from the early 1800s. The Hambrights had bought it after John Martin. John Martin was the treasurer of the Cherokee Nation. He lived in that house with one of his wives. His other wife, which was a sister, I think lived up around Waterville. You just build them a separate house and everybody's happier. But anyway, that was part of their lifestyle.
Yeah.
But he had 9 slave houses there.
So Cherokees had, they had 2 wives or more than one wife?
Some of them did, particularly the more prominent rich ones did. Then some of them just had one wife for 50 years,
The poor ones just had one wife.
Well, I don't know. A lot of times, the wives would be sisters, and then that way, if something, of course, they died in childbirth quite easily. They did. And so, if somebody was lost in childbirth, she knew her sister would raise her children the way she would have raised them. Is some of the thought that I've been told.
Now, but the Cherokee, my understanding is that they ran the Yuchi Indians out. So
Yeah,
it was
did.
sort of bad karma in a sense.
There was other factions coming in and doing stuff, running other people out. It was like anything else. It was a land grab. People wanted property and stuff, and there was wars going on, and the Cherokee were trying to avoid wars, and so they just came into this area, and the Yuchi just said, well, they didn't have big battles and knock people out or anything. Now, there were villages that, archaeological studies and old records indicate that they were just kind of abandoned, which usually was because of illness or...
And I don't think there were that many of them.
Who?
The Yuchi Indians.
I don't know about... I don't think so either. I think that it was probably just a small band of, a neighboring tribe or something. It wasn't like there was... a lot of people removed themselves early and went out west on their own. When all the stuff started in the 18 teens, they said, well, I'm not going to stay here and mess with this stuff. And they just went on out west and got started, started building stuff. And, so when this group that hung on for so long got out there, there were people that already had businesses, there were schools established, there were towns established.
Probably been writing back and forth to tell them how it was going.
Yeah. And then when John Ross got out there, he became the chief of them. He was the chief from...
Now, wasn't he just like an 8th Indian?
Yeah.
How'd they accept him?
The U.S. government is the one that gets hung up on the quantity of blood that you have. That's how they thought that they could, separate people, was figuring out what their quantity of blood was. A Cherokee then would say, do you live like a Cherokee? Do you have our belief system? It was more of a cultural thing. It's if you were Cherokee. There were missionaries that were white that lived among the Indians for decades, and they were accepted as members.
Most of those were Methodist, right?
And yeah, what's that other thing? Mavarian. I never have gotten into that very much. But you know, there was a big mission down at Brainerd Mission that educated and housed some of the younger Cherokees. There was Red Clay Mission here in Flint Springs, or Red Clay, yeah. And then Candy's Creek Mission was the very first post office in Bradley County. And they said, what do you want to call this place? And he said, well, Candy's Creek.
Have you ever gotten much into, I've looked before for stagecoach maps and routes, and that's almost an impossible thing to find. I don't know.
I think that sometimes it's the stock road. It's called the stock road. But I know that one of the stagecoach roads was probably
Old Federal Road?
well, they would have been on the Old Federal Road, but coming through here from Knoxville, they would have come, well, usually you look for a street named Broadway or Broad Street. Those were the streets that you could turn a 16 horse or whatever wagon around in.
Can you imagine a 16-horse wagon?
I mean, you know, just get. And so I think the stock road from Benton is Benton Pike. It came up the Federal Road, which is 411 now, and you see where Old Federal Road will go over, and it goes over by the north end of that ferry that you were talking about at the Hillebrand House, and it comes over and goes down Benton Pike and comes into Bradley County, and I think that's why Andrew Taylor's house was where it's at.
That's what I'm thinking.
Central Avenue came in, and that was the old stock road, and Broad, and what was originally
Broad Street,
yeah, where and Ocoee Street that goes to Knoxville was either part of the stock road or it was the stagecoach road. I know the stagecoach came down to the hotel that was there at the courthouse real early in the 1830s.
So we think that, well, my understanding is that at the top of the hill, that is where the stagecoach stopped, and they'd walk down to Taylor Springs for water.
I don't know about that. I know that there was a stagecoach stop down on Bendabout Farms. That's what Mr. Johnson built that cabin out of. That's over by the lake. It was originally at the corner of Chattanooga Pike and Old Chattanooga Pike in Alabama.
Now,
the old Alabama Road is the Federal Road. And on the old map for the removal, the old Alabama Road is Walker Valley Road.
golly.
I'm a fountain of useless information.
Do you think that all of these wars and moving people out and stuff like that, is it going to happen again? I mean, we say, oh, it won't happen again, but neither will convenience stores without gas stations. Neither will, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I hope not, but there are really bad things happen to people, you know, about being moved and stuff. Well, you kind of look, I saw a young woman, I judged a documentary contest for high school kids, and her documentary was about Roane County, I believe. And her grandparents lived on this piece of property that they were a white family that came in 1819, when that part of Cherokee Nation became the United States.
So it
was a different. See,
yeah,
and
it's moved.
Chattanooga was 1819.
They just kept,
and it just went squeezed down till it just got this little part of Georgia, you know, a little bit of Georgia and all that down in there. But they had come in right after the Indians were removed, and then at some point TVA took part of the land from them, and at some point a road came through and took part of the land, and the property finally was down to just one little piece of property that was still in the family. Well, that's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Let me tell you about Vanstown.
Vans.
VANN, like the Van House in Chatsworth.
Yep, I've been there.
Well, one of the
Chief Van.
Well, we call all the leaders chief. He wasn't really chief, just Chief Ross was the only chief. But anyway, over where Harrison Bay is now, and you'll see a historical marker out there on the highway. and it says Van Town. Well, maybe he was Rich Joe Van. He was one of the Van boys. I don't know off the top of my head. And there were horse racing tracks there.
At Harrison Bay.
They bet on horses, horse racing tracks. He had a whole town. He had the ferry. He had everything that made money in that town. He controlled it. And it's all under the lake now. Now, where Whirlpool's sitting today out on Benton Pike, see Benton Pike, main drag. Deer in the Water lived out there. Well, you know that name because he was one of the places that was considered for downtown Cleveland, but he got moved over here at Taylor's place. Now I kind of.
So they had a little argument.
They had a vote. Every white man over the age of 18 got to vote, and it won by one vote for it to be at Taylor's place instead of Deer in the Water place. Now this thing about you got to have water. Well, that's a swamp out there. There's water out there too.
Yeah.
But anyway, Deer in the Water.
Deer in the Water
was his name. Deer in the Water. He was right there where Whirlpool's at. There were horse racing out there too with 3 tracks. And it was quite a complex out there too. But he had sold out and left before the removal or had died or something because he's just got a small evaluation. I think he might have gotten older and just kind of gotten rid of stuff. But he's got a small evaluation. You know where G Creek is, Polk County. That was a huge Indian village. Massive. Of course, you can see that right there on that river, big valleys. And there at the tree place, there's a huge river mound there.
And that was the perfect place for it.
That was a perfect place for it. Well, in 1970, I guess, or so, the people there, the history people started saying, we need to preserve this. It needs to be a state park, or it needs to be this, or it needs to be that. So people all over the nation can come here and learn about, how our Cherokee lived. Well, the county commission at that time voted to let it be developed into a subdivision so they could get tax revenue off of it. Things that makes Debbie go, But that's the kind of thing that happened before we started thinking, gosh, we need to save this stuff, because they would have never put the road through that mound like they did. They would have never built on top of that, and it would have been a major, major educational tool.
Have you ever seen some subdivisions or some place of business that absolutely, no matter what goes in there, it will not flourish? And I always felt like maybe it was built on an Indian mound.
Well,
is there any? Did the Cherokee have any? I mean, what was there?
Let me tell you what, a well-known Cherokee. His last name is Ledford, and he's one of the Katuah warriors with the Eastern Band, and they were redoing the museum at Red Clay, and the lady that was redoing it had asked him, what is it that you think people need to know about this place? And he said they need to know that this is a very special place, and that when the council meetings were going on there, that those people prayed over that land, and they prayed over that land, and they prayed over that land. And that is very special land to them now. So that's how they handled it. They would pray over the land. Not that they were just trying to empower the land. But that's what he says, and that's why the women wear the skirts. It draws up the energy from the earth.
What was the? Is that right?
Yeah.
What do you think the Indians? What was their religion?
Well, they talk about the Indians today. The natives today will often refer to the Great Spirit, but 98% of them that I know personally are just Methodist or Baptist or whatever. They've, just moved into our religion.
But if they believed in the Great Spirit,
Some of them still do, but they still have their religion.
couldn't that be God too?
Yes, that's what I always
really.
think. That's always what I
It's
think.
just
that they're
in a
saying.
creator.
Yeah, the Great Spirit.
Boy, it's interesting, isn't it?
And they think the water at Red Clay is very special, and it is.
Do you know any 100% purebred Cherokees, if there's such a
There
thing?
were very few even here during the removal, because you got to think that the white people had been coming into this area since the 1500s. And we meet, we breed, and so there were very few. Very few.
15.
There are still full bloods in Cherokee and the Snow Hill community. That they can prove all the way down their line that they
You mean Cherokee, North Carolina?
Uh-huh.
What's the Snow Hill community?
It's just a community that's there that people live in. I don't know if it's part of the boundary, if it's on the edge of the boundary, but they're
Because now you go there, it's the casino, and when you go down there now, I used to go when I was a kid and walk down that street, get by the slingshots and stuff.
yeah, the little bow and arrows.
Now there's only like 2 there. It's all about the casino. So we're almost moving them out again in a different way.
Or they're competing with us on our level. They're acquiring a lot of their land back, and I really like that. Like there was a site that I guess they purchased it back. They had studied and they knew that there had been a villager there or something. They went in and did an archaeological study. There was a village there where the casino's at too. Archaeological study, and removed artifacts. A lot of times they'll just bury artifacts, because an artifact that mean anything taken away from its site. Unless it's something really unique that they want everybody to see. And they put a women's clinic there.
Now let me ask you this: how did Cherokee, North Carolina? How did that come about? Why move them all the way to Toccoa?
Okay, that was something that was done with North Carolina Cherokee. And I'm not an expert on it, but I'll tell you the simple 3rd grade teacher version of it. That same thing was happening. People were moving in and moving them off their land and, all that stuff. So the government kind of came in and said, well, we're going to put you somewhere that nobody will bother you. And basically it was somewhere where you can't farm because it's so hilly and stuff. But they kind of put them in there. And they were living on the land, and at some point in time, the government came and tried to take the land back. And there was a white guy living up there. His last name was Thomas, and he went around. The Cherokees would save up their money, give the money to him. He'd go buy their property back, and they could move back on their property. So they paid for their own property to get it back. And then at some point in time, it became the boundary. But the removal worked like this. There had been an agreement that said, we're going to give you this land, this piece of land right here. We're going to give you this piece of land, you can live on it. Well, that never got unwritten from the books, erased from the books. And so when the removal happened, they came in and they started trying to gather up people, and they said, hey, look at this. And they said, oh, okay. And so they kind of left them alone. But they gathered up all the other people that were outside the boundary, took them to Nottowahela, and they walked from Nottowahela through Coker Creek and Tellico over to Englewood, and they walked down the railroad track at Athens. The railroad that runs beside the road now didn't have the rails on it then. You could kind of claim your that you were going to put a railroad in by just start grading and stuff. So some people had done that. It was graded, but it didn't have the railroad ties on it or anything. So they walked from Athens down the railroad to Calhoun. They slept where the park is at. It's called the Meadowlands. They slept there in the park that night. So there's a piece of the original Trail of Tears right there behind that trucking company out on Highway 11. It's marked. And then the next day they brought them down to, I guess, to Walker's Ferry and brought them across the river and put them in Fort Cass. So the group from Cherokee, they gathered them up in Murphy, down where the rest stop is, like at Andrews or something. There was a fort there. There was a fort in downtown Murphy. There was Fort Lindsay. They gathered them up at those forts and then marched them all in. So all of those folks walked farther than anybody else on the trail. They had an extra 80 miles. And then when they got into Fort Cass and they got taken out west, they had done another 800 miles.
Camping out the whole time?
Camping out the whole time.
Through the winter, I guess?
Oh, yeah. Oh, the summers, I think, would have been most miserable to me. And, we've had people in here studying it for a long time up in Charleston. Charleston's done a really good job. If we can just preserve what, what we found. Excuse me. But there's road beds and things up there, Don't go digging on people's farms just because I said that.
Yeah. Boy, it's terrible, isn't it, what happened with the Indians?
And it's kind of interesting, like...
If they were already being sort of mixed race by then?
Yes.
Because...
Well, there's an account in the Nashville newspaper that the Indians came through. A group of the Indians came through. Several of them came through there. But some little girl was heard saying, and it's quoted in this newspaper, but Papa, where's the Indians? Because a lot of Scotch Irishmen had married into the families. And so there were, biracial children. And then the guy named Bushyhead was a great big red-headed Scotch Irishman that had some name that the Cherokees couldn't remember. So they started calling him Bushyhead. And that became their last name. Mm-hmm. And that was the great whatever grandfather of Jesse Bushyhead, which was one of the most, it was really well known from that time period. His piece of property is down where Cleveland High School is now. His white house was still standing until the 1960s. We were using it for the poor farm. They had like 8 or 10 people in there that didn't have family to take care of them, and they were old and couldn't provide for themselves. So that was the county farmland. We grew vegetables there to help them, and of course our workhouse was over there.
As early as 1960.
As late as 1960. His big white house was sitting right there where Cleveland High School is.
Now that was what we'd call today the nursing home.
Well,
is that right?
Right. Yeah, but just everybody stayed at home basically.
Yeah.
But in 1960, when we tore that building down, we had just built our nursing home on part of Jack Walker's property, Bradley County Nursing Home, and they moved those few folks down there, tore down that building, built Cleveland High School.
And I moved to Norman Chapel Road.
There you go. And Mr. Easterly, that was our postmaster for years.
Yeah. Bob.
Bob, good old, he called me Miss History. I said, this is Debbie Moore. And he said, hey, Miss History, how are you? Come on down. I know you want to talk to me. But he said the road came from the north, which was, I guess, Mouse Creek or Valley Head Road. It came down, and when it got to where Cleveland High School is now, it just turned and came over and went over the hill, over here towards Coy Street. And it didn't go from where the nursing home is straight. That was built, when the nursing home was built.
So it took a turn.
And he said it was called the County Farm Road. It came down out of the valley and it turned like right where Cleveland High School is now. It would go right in front of Jesse Bushyhead's house. And then it would have gone over to, somebody help me, is that Sunset Drive or something?
Sunset Drive, yeah.
And then it just
I think it used
went
to
over
have
towards the Philor house because that was an Indian, that was John Martin's property too. That's where the Cherokee Courthouse was.
I can almost envision where that road would have turned now, going down Sunset.
Yeah.
Now that was 1960. We barely remember it.
Yeah. Well,
now,
and see, I didn't remember it until he started saying something. But I think one of the most interesting things I'd ever seen, they did a charrette in Charleston, and that's where they study everything. The U.S. government did before they, kind of declared it being what it is. I mean, it's a national historical area. People come from all over to come to Charleston and go through that little museum and stuff. But they took the removal map that we have. We have a map of the removal that's got all these little campsites marked on it. We know there was this many people here and that many people there, and all this. And they made it the same size as a modern day map. You put it on there. Old Alabama Road's right on top of Walker Valley Road, except where they've changed it a little bit, make it a little straighter over the years. And all Wool Street, Scott Street, That's the names of all the U.S. officials that were up there during the removal. You know, after the Indians were gone, they named all the streets like that. But it was 4 miles wide from the center of Charleston. And out on the roads, on the main roads, they would have a little hut that had soldiers in it. And anybody trying to come in or anybody trying to leave would have to talk. Now, could you have slipped off? Yeah, you could have run away. But where are you going to go? You can't go back to your property. You don't have any friends that still live at their property. Where are you going to go? And that's when some of them did run off up into the mountains and went up and kind of joined in with the ones up in Cherokee. Now, if you were an Indian woman and you were married to a rich white man, a richer white man.
You had him made, didn't you?
Well, he could at least, you know, she got property. If the property was an Indian reserve, she got the money or he got her money.
Yeah.
And he could have gone and maybe have bought property and lived here, but I think they were worried about the safety of their family too.
Yeah, who knew?
Who knew? And as soon as they were moving the people out, these people, imagine today if you just knew that, if people knew that people were being moved out of their house and they weren't going to be there, they had looters like crazy. Or there were people there that had bought the property. Yeah, they had to pay for the property, but they'd bought the property, but they were out there selling off the personal goods. And so for years, they filled out, the Cherokee filled out applications out in the Indian Territory that said, I didn't get, I lost. They claimed things like big, vats that you would fix sorghum in and that kind of stuff. They said that, they indicated what all they'd lost and the government was supposed to pay them for it. And sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. Down at Red Clay during the removal and during the council meetings, well, you're having thousands of people come there to hear what's going on. They didn't have CNN or they had a newspaper, but they didn't have, any news source. So the whole families would go and they'd stand around the council house and listen to what the important people were saying and what the arguments were and all that kind of stuff. Well, the people that were entrepreneurs came in and they built little houses over there. There's 3 samples of those sitting on the property that were in the property evaluations. And there were people who came to visit, like newspaper people, wrote articles about staying there, and they had a fresh bed of pine needles to lay on. I thought, Lord, I wouldn't be able to sleep it off if I had to lay on pine needles. But it was at least Motel 6 to them. And there were people that had vending things.
So even the Cherokee people had their own people that were
vendors. Yeah. And they had applied to get paid back for the loss of building those buildings. Well, it appears to me that the men got paid, but the Cherokee women that did that kind of stuff, they had to argue for a long time to get their money back.
Maybe it's not that this person's mean or that person. Maybe we all have it in us, but it just depends on which side you're on.
I think people just got wrapped up in it, and they said, well, everybody else is doing it, so it's okay. But like John Ross, he was chief. He was in Washington arguing about the removal, and when he got home, his wife and children had been moved into one room in the house, and this family had taken over the house. They kind of felt like, well, I'm
and he was the man, wasn't he?
He was the man, and he couldn't do anything about it. Hey, he just had to move on up here into Flint Springs with his family. See, we got a lot of the leaders from the Cherokee Nation in Bradley County when they had to leave Georgia because they couldn't do business in Georgia.
That's where John Ross came from, right? Or his brother.
John Ross lived right there in Flint Springs, 3 miles up the road.
And his father was from
Rossville.
Rossville.
His grandfather was a McDonald. He was from down there too. You had John Ross that gave the property for the Red Hill Mission to be built, the school. So he was taking care of it.
The Methodist school?
It wasn't a Methodist school. It was just a mission. I don't know what. It's Dr. Butler, and his wife ran it. His sister, her last name is Mulkey. She was married to a white man. She lived in that same area. Now, everybody else, 90% of them walked on the trail. Even the old sick people walked. So you read those reports, there's not that many wagons. You got 900 people and 9 wagons. they were carrying supplies, and maybe there was one wagon for sick and elderly and dying.
And moccasins, or they have real shoes?
Well, I think some of them were lucky to have shoes at all by the time you walked 19 miles a day for how many 19 miles could you walk? You know, I could.
Yeah, what if you got to use the bathroom?
Yeah, well, it was really ugly. And I forgot where I was going with this, so we'll have to go back now. It'll come back around in a few minutes. It was real important, whatever it was.
But my point is, if the poorhouse was here 80 years ago, 60 years ago, and prior to that, 190 years ago, this was all the Cherokee Nation.
And it was striving.
Now, yeah, they didn't have any problems.
Well, they had problems, but they took care of their problems.
Well, fast forward to 200 years. Fast forward 60. It'll be what, 2080? I won't be here.
I won't be here either.
Well, they say, yeah, they used to drive down Ocoee Street down through. I mean, what would be different? You say, well, not much. I wouldn't bet on it.
We say, okay, oh man, that was awful, and that was way back then. Well, think about segregation. I mean, that's just in the rearview mirror, and it's still stuff's going on about segregation.
We're still arguing.
We're still arguing. And so, at some point in time, the community thought some of that was acceptable. Well, that's the same thing that happened. But the one thing that I often say, what were those people thinking about?
Yeah.
Well, up in Calhoun, when you go up by the river in Calhoun, there's a little white church over there, and I can't remember the name of it right now.
I know what you're talking about.
The Cherokee had attended that church with those white people for generations.
That's right. It's a Methodist church.
It's a Methodist church. They had attended with them. This is at the time of the removal. Well, a short time later, there's an encampment of people right across the river from that church.
That they were watching.
Now, can you imagine if the Cherokee's sitting there, they've been thrown out of their home, they've lost everything they had, they're getting sick, they're dying, they're hungry.
Babies need diapers.
Right. Yeah, imagine that, what a mess that was.
Yeah.
Well, you have them sitting over here, and they can hear the people singing over here at this church that they sang with 2 weeks ago. And then what were these people at the church thinking about Sister whoever is over here now?
And praying to God. Praying to God.
Yeah. That's one of the times I think I would just like to know what they were thinking.
What's God thinking,
What's
too?
God thinking, too?
What are you praying to...
There were Cherokees that lived up in Turtletown till the 1920s. They were over there by Zion Church. Zion...
Now that was...
The Cat family.
What do you mean they lived there?
Well, you see, you run off everybody, and then all of a sudden you need to build some roads. And, well, who can build roads? Well, nobody here. So they invited some of them to come back out here. And they went to Turtletown.
So come back out here and we'll give you a place to work and live and blah, 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 blah.
Right. So they came out here.
A form of,
Yeah, and probably was glad to come home.
Tickled to death, I guess.
Gave them the property that nobody else wanted. You know, they were out there by Zion. It's Zion Hill, I think it is.
I can't think of where that's. I don't get to Turtletown much, but
you just, you just go if you're going like towards.
Yeah, you go past.
There's a big
Ducktown.
white church with a great big cemetery. It's one of the few integrated cemeteries around from that age because the Cherokee went there with them and they were buried beside them and everything. Well, as the towns developed and the mining fired up, people wanted housing and stuff, and so they started being kind of mean to them and stuff. And they just kind of removed themselves. They went over the hill and went over to Snow Hill. I think that's the name of Snow Hill over in Cherokee, North Carolina, and lived.
I'd like to go to that. How big is that?
It's I don't know. I go through it and it just looks like a bunch of little houses to me. It's not it's just homes and stuff.
Is it on the way to the
families.
casino?
No. It's over, like if you're coming from off of the Skyway, through Robbinsville, and you're going towards Cherokee, I guess, and it's over in there. But I don't know a whole lot about it, but I just know that there's still people there that are full-bloods. There are full-bloods out west, too. Very few. But if you're a member of the Cherokee Nation out there, your blood quantum does not matter. If you had somebody that their name, you can prove that you belong to somebody on those rosters of people that were removed and arrived out west, then you can be a member of the Cherokee Nation. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but they don't check the blood quantum and stuff. Over here in the Eastern Band, see, they only have like 32,000 people. And then out west is 400,000 people or something, because you don't ever drop off the rolls. But if families encourage their children to marry another Cherokee so that they can stay in the tribe.
What if you're in Cherokee, North Carolina, and you get in trouble legally? Will you have the same courts that you do here?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Would the policemen stop you?
I think that their policemen are in charge of Cherokee, North Carolina. When the pandemic hit, they closed that place down.
What did they close?
They closed the roads because they were going to keep people out of there. This is before the vaccines and everything.
What about the casino?
I think it closed down too. They just closed the roads and said, until we figure this out, we're not losing our elders.
This is a part of our history that all we can do is just try to learn from it.
Yes.
But what can we learn? You know, what are the changes? I mean, electric cars. Will there be some type of transportation other than cars? Will we not need these roads?
I'm still waiting for the Jetson cars.
I saw this one movie where they all had hovercrafts.
Yeah.
And they didn't use roads anymore. So, I don't know, but is human nature the same basic human nature as it is now?
I think we're going to have to realize that we can't go back and fix the injustices that came before us, but we need to get on some level playing field with everybody. You know, people need to be able to live where they want to live and do what they want to, not do what they want to do, but, you know, strive.
It's complicated.
It is
I would hate to
complicated.
be in charge.
I would love to have all the answers, but I have none of the answers.
And, you know, and then we're just talking about our country. Mm-hmm. What about the other countries and the other countries?
And then throw a pandemic in there to really mess with things.
Yeah. Boy, how did you fare during did you ever get the COVID?
I did not get the COVID. I've gotten my 2 shots, and I qualified for a booster since I've had cancer. I'm a 7-year cancer survivor.
What kind did you have?
I had breast cancer, and in 2014.
Did that scare you?
Yes, and having cancer doesn't scare you nearly as bad as when they start explaining to you what they're going to do, and you know, all the side effects and things. But it's what it is, and when you have lumps and bumps in your life, you just pray and keep moving forward. I wanted to say something about, you know, we were talking about how I got interested in history and stuff, but through all this, we did a documentary on Caney Creek, dirt track racing, local restaurants. Most of them were gone, but some of them were still hanging on, like the Rebel. The history of wrestling at Bradley High School. I wrote I provided the information. There was interviews done on family members and Confederate soldiers about 100 years ago, and Mrs. Campbell gave me a copy of those interviews, and I put together a book called Confederate Voices and gave them the opportunity to tell their stories. And so I did that. It won a national award. I wrote a book about Caney Creek. I wrote a book about dirt track racing, and I was working. I don't know how in the world I got it all done.
Did you when did you write? Did you have any other hobbies, or was that it?
Well, I think that's well, and I was doing the radio show, and I was doing, I was working full time, and had grandkids. I just burning all the engines, I think.
Looking back at that period, do you say, man, that was great?
I do, because I made a lot of lifetime friends, and had great friends that would come on the radio show. I had a group of guys, P-Dab Matthews, that's gone now.
I listened to it every Saturday morning.
I loved it. And Doyle Palmer, he's gone now too.
I like Doyle.
And Gene Flowers.
Yeah, the surveyor.
No, he worked with the sheriff's
I
department.
remember listening to Hoyt Clark on there.
Hoyt was only on there one time, but those guys, if somebody canceled on Wednesday on me, and I needed somebody on Saturday morning, I could call P-Dab, or I could call Doyle, or I could call, and I'd say, can you come help me with the show Saturday? Yeah, I'll be there. What are we going to talk about? It didn't matter. Mm-hmm. They'd show up and they could talk about it. And that was always so amazing to me, and I really enjoyed him. Doc was another one of those. I think he kept count. I think he was on the show 9 times in 8 years.
Doyle Palmer, he was an interesting person, wasn't he?
He was. He was just
he always said Doyle Palmer.
Doyle Palmer, P-A-R-M-E-R.
Yeah.
And he was really good about, I could call him and say, I need to know where the Powder Springs was. Well, Debbie, let me get my shoes on, and you meet me over at the cemetery, and I'll take you over.
Was he ever married?
No, he was never married. No
and
children.
his wife, his cousin was Bancroft?
He was related to the Bancrofts.
That's it. What was her name?
Well, there was a whole bunch of them. There was one that taught out at Prospect, and I graduated from high school with, and her first name's leaving me at the moment.
Joanne Bancroft.
Okay, I don't know her.
That was his
But then
cousin.
You got people like Doyle that would tell you about them moving Bancroft Church. That's not the location he was always in. They took teams of mules and moved that church. That stuff to me was really interesting. But anyway, I think that's kind of kept me going too. Ron was really exceptionally good too. He could interview anybody about anything. Mm-hmm. And he said, I always know when you look at me and your mouth's open like that I needed to ask a question, and he could. And but I'm glad that we did it, and they're recorded and they're on YouTube.
Do you look back at those times and say, man, I stayed too busy. I should have gone to the beach in Florida.
I'm a busy person anyway. I'm just busier doing different things now that I'm retired. I walk a lot. I try to walk 3 or 4 miles a day. And
where do you walk at? Where do you walk at?
Well, I just walk anywhere there's a trail. My favorite thing these days are the rails to trails, and it's railroad tracks that the
Silver Comet.
Well, the Eureka Trail up in Athens is one of them. It's where they've had railroads, and the railroad company just turns the property over, and they get grants, and they make it into a trail. They're very wide. They usually only have a 5% grade anywhere.
Now,
up in the Smokies, they're all up against the river and stuff. There's one down in Saudi Daisy that's fabulous called the Big Gulf. But I like to do that. I have a very nice gentleman friend that we go walking together, and I had never camped before in my life, and I've been glamping, I'll call it. And we just stay gone and on the go all the time, and that's really nice.
I did the Silver Comet, which is another one of those railroad
Where
things.
is that one?
It starts in Atlanta and goes to Anniston, Alabama.
Yes. I've been on part of that.
72 miles one way, I think.
Yes, I've been on a small part of that. But Florida, it goes almost all the way across the Panhandle now. Those bike trails do. Now, I've decided I like my arms and legs attached to my body, so I don't get on a bicycle. But
so you go more hiking, or?
Well, I call it walking. But now we have done some pretty strenuous trails. Last week we went to Benton Falls, which is not real strenuous. The trail's not, but to get down to the falls and get back up out of that hole is pretty strenuous.
And it's not but about 45-minute walk, is it?
Well, we take longer than that. I was stopping and taking a picture of every leaf along the way. There's a lot of those up in the Smokies too, but we've done. I wish I had started logging our miles in the Smokies, but I guess I could start now.
Do you think that, are you glad that you retired, or would you have rather, did you teach till how long?
I taught 39 years. I could have retired at 30 years and still had my health insurance and started drawing my retirement. I don't know what I was waiting on, but it was kind of like my mission work. The last 14.
Where did you teach at?
I taught at Oak Grove for 25 years. I was a special ed teacher, and then I was a reading specialist, and then I taught 4th grade and 3rd grade. And along the way, I started getting a lot of children that didn't speak English, and that really bothered me. I didn't feel like I was helping them as much as something I thought surely there's a little bit more I can do for these children than what I'm doing. So I went back to school and got my endorsement in English as a second language, and I moved out to the county system and did that for 14 years. And I was at Black Fox almost all the time.
Was there a lot of non-English speaking kids at Black Fox?
Yes.
Where do they come from?
Well, they're mostly Russian and Ukrainian. There's big populations of Russian and Ukrainian down in there.
Well, what are they thinking? How are they supposed to come here without?
Well, when you live in a country where, you might be killed for being a Christian, or if you don't have clean water like a lot of the Mexican folks do, and Spanish and South American folks, if there's no medical treatment for your family. I always said when we back in the 80s when the boat people were coming from Cuba, I would have been the first person trying to get my kids to America. And they come here, and a lot of them, they're the people that came that was speaking no English came, 25 years ago. Maybe their grandparents came, but there's still Spanish spoken in the homes, or Russians or Ukrainian spoken in the
What
homes.
I would get confused at if I was them is knowing which word was English and which was Spanish.
Well, little kids don't think anything about it. They just think everybody's learning new words.
But it's almost a. Of course, now I know more Spanish than I did. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's just meshing the language.
It's meshing together, and that's fine. That's fine. It's and our kids need to know that there's people from different cultures, and it's it was an interesting job. And like I say, I kind of felt like it was mission work. Could I speak Russian? No, but I can draw really well.
Now, when you first started teaching, you would have never thought.
I would have never
that
thought.
Before it was over, you'd be learning a second language.
It was the Lord's plan, though, because I was working with those special ed kids, and the techniques that I used over here to help these kids was the same thing. You have to know to repeat things and show them pictures, and they have to hear the English language used to pick it up. And I think probably one of the funniest times I would have is those little bitty 2nd grade little girls would want to teach me words in Spanish. And I'd say it with this accent, and they would just cackle. They thought that was so funny.
Yeah, because
you got to understand the ones that are just, coming from home. Mama may have been here for quite a while. She may be the 2nd or 3rd generation. But that little child coming into kindergarten has never been to preschool. They've never seen biscuits and gravy. They have no idea what they're trying to serve them for breakfast.
Yeah.
And they didn't, there's a lot to learn besides just the language. But those children, most of the time, they understand the importance of language. And when they get to be 2nd and 3rd graders, you'll see them sitting up on the counter at Cleveland Utilities helping their mom sign up for electricity. Mm-hmm. Or you see the car in front of you at Hardee's, it pulls up and the speaker's at the back window. I know what's going on. That window goes down and this little person's head sticks out and they order breakfast. And then when they pull up to the window, Mama pulls up till the kids are even with the window, and that little hand will come out with the money and takes the change. They know how important language is.
And they evidently know how important family is because they stick together.
Yeah, they do. They do.
Unusually so,
and they
don't
don't
they?
have to have, well, I don't know. They don't have to have babysitters because most of our Ukrainian families have 9, 10 kids or something. There's always an older sister there or something that'll take care of the kids, or aunts. I mean, if you wouldn't want to live in a subdivision where nobody else spoke your language if you could live 2 subdivisions away, and the aunt lives there. So they kind of cling close together, and I understand that. And I've gotten some mighty good burritos and stuff as a thank you note. I always like to see that they use what is it called?
Tortillas?
Well, they use wax paper instead of aluminum foil like we do.
Yeah.
I saw that wax paper coming in, and I knew I was getting a treat.
Do you think that? Why do you think you like to stay busy? Do you think it helps you?
I think a person that can get something done is always a busy person. And I just do a lot of things.
You ever read Poor Richard's Almanac?
I know what it is. I mean, I've seen them.
It's funny to me that it was written so long ago, but it's just so relevant today.
It is. You're right.
And if you look at all the other stuff, what is as relevant today as it was then? Cars aren't. Mm-hmm. I mean, the only thing that seems to be relevant is people's actions and what other people wrote down.
That's right.
They seem to be
and
relevant.
I think I always like to think, we think, oh, well, the Farmer's Almanac predicts the natives were doing that a long time ago. They were studying the astronomy and stuff and watching and knew how it affected crops and stuff. Well, Dee, we have talked a long time.
Are we ready?
I'm ready to shut this thing down. Thank you so much. I've never been on a podcast before.
It's been an honor.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.